All right, welcome everybody to episode 19 of SFF Addicts, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by a fantastic panel of authors. Today's topic is also something that I'm really excited to delve into, which is martial arts in sci-fi and fantasy. As a lover of old school martial arts films and a casual viewer of mixed martial arts, cage fighting, and stuff like that, this is a topic that fascinates me despite my actual lack of personal experience. But all of my panelists today do have experience writing martial arts in their fiction, as well as practicing or having practiced martial arts in some form. So, first up is Fonda Lee, making her second appearance on the show. She's a black belt in both karate and kung fu, and is the world and fantasy and Aurora award-winning author of the Green Bone Saga. And she also wrote Zeroboxer and the Exo series. So, welcome back to the show, Fonda. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back on, Adrian.
It's a pleasure. It's good to see you again. And my next three guests are all making their first appearances on the show, including KS Villoso. She practiced Aikido and Filipino martial arts during her childhood in Manila, Philippines, later immigrating to British Columbia, Canada. Shout out to my home province. And now she is a fantasy author, having penned the Chronicles of the Bitch Queen series, the Argates Epilogues, and more. So welcome, Kay. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And we also have Sam Hawke with us. She is lawyer by day, a jiu-jitsu instructor by night, as well as the author of the epic fantasy duology, The Poison Wars, starting with City of Lies and followed up with Hollow Empire. So happy to have you here, Sam. How are you?
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And lastly, Alexander Darwin. He is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, teaching and training the form. And he is the author of the Combat Codes saga, including the Combat Codes, Grievar's Blood, and Blacklight Born. But some exciting news to share for all of you, which is that the Combat Codes saga has been picked up by Orbit Books and will be re-released starting next year in the spring. So welcome to the show, Alexander, and a heartfelt congratulations on that news. It's really awesome.
Thank you, Adrian. Glad to be here. Good to see everyone.
Yeah, man. Good to have you here. So I mentioned briefly in each of your introductions that, you have certain experiences with martial arts, but to give folks a better idea of, your relationship with martial arts, can you share a bit about how you got started and what it means to you personally? So Alexander, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I had a little bit of an unorthodox start. I grew up in the Boston area in the U.S., and I did the kind of regular thing where I did karate, and that when I was really young, and that didn't have much of an effect on me. It was more just something you had your kids do in the 80s.
Yeah.
And
The trend back
I also
then,
was
yeah.
not that big of exactly. I wasn't that big of a fan of like martial arts movies either when I was growing up, when I was pretty young. And then in high school I did kung fu, which was fun because I was never really that good at team sports. So I started kind of, figuring out late, I guess, 17 or 18 or that I was more of the type of person that liked to do individualized sports, which was good to find out then, but a bit too late. Throughout high school, I was trying all the other sports and was really just terrible at not a very athletic kid at all. I never did that many sports as a kid, but I did enjoy kung fu quite a bit. But it wasn't until university, I went to Boston University, that I started in the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club around 2003, and that is kind of where my passion for very nerdy things like movies and Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy books kind of melded with the real world, in that I found essentially a form of magic being performed on me, and since then I was very entranced by it and have not turned back, and went on to I've practiced that for almost 20 years now.
Man, that's fantastic. And I love how you portrayed in this way of like, from the perspective of people who love fantasy and love science fiction and things like that, the sort of magic and the wonder and all of that. But the fact that you felt that for Brazilian jiu-jitsu is amazing. And I love that I could see it just in your face, like something changed, this little spark ignited within you,
Yeah. I know a few of the other panelists here have done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I had no experience with wrestling. I'd messed around, gotten beat up essentially by some of my friends that were wrestlers in high school, but really had not had any grappling experience. And then my experience starting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was just like grappling with a guy who's probably 140 pounds, him being able to control me as if by magic, like with me being entirely unable to do anything, was a very eye-opening experience. And you hear the same thing over and over from many people that start grappling in general. And that was a pretty cool thing that got me into it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Fonda, what about you? What was sort of your introduction to martial arts, and what does it mean to you personally?
Well, it's funny hearing Alex talk about doing karate in the 80s because that's exactly what I did. So I actually was a big fan of martial arts movies and media, and wanted to be a Ninja Turtle, and then started doing karate, and then didn't stop. So I just kept advancing through karate. I did it for well into my 20s, became a second degree black belt, and then went through some moves in my life, and ended up here in the Pacific Northwest, where I could not find a karate dojo right near where I was, and started did kind of a swerve and started training in kung fu. I did that for over a decade, until I reached black belt there. And then along the way, I've also done some Brazilian jiu-jitsu, a bit of Wing Chun and Tai Chi. And yeah, it's like I've had my fits and starts with martial arts, but definitely I got kind of inspired to do it at a young age, partially because of media and the Bruce Lee movies and that I watched, and the Karate Kid, like all that, definitely played a big part in sort of sparking this lifelong part, element of my personality.
Hmm. Awesome. And Sam, what about you? Sort of, what's your relationship with martial arts? How'd you get started with that, and what does it mean to you to practice it and teach it as well?
I always love hearing other authors talk about martial arts because I feel like it is a sport with the greatest crossover with nerdism. Like,
Yes.
I feel like more nerds are drawn to martial arts than any other sport. And so basically exactly like Alex, I was not a team sport player of any description, and I never really liked any team sports of any kind.
Yeah.
But I was always just really obsessed with martial arts. And I don't really know. I mean, part of it was probably the same thing as what Fonda was talking about. It's probably the media I was consuming when I was a kid. But my dad had done a Japanese sort of we call it Japanese jiu-jitsu. It's predominantly Japanese jiu-jitsu, but it's got a bunch of other elements, sort of like a primitive MMA kind of thing without the competitive fighting stuff. So it had some boxing and some judo and some karate and some jiu-jitsu. And my dad had done that before my older brother and sister were born. And then my older brother and sister started training in that probably I think my brother started when I was about 9 or 10. And I was desperate, absolutely desperate to do it with him. But my dad didn't want to drive me to the junior class. I was very small, one of 5 siblings, and I'm the little one. He didn't want to take me to the junior class and then have to come back and get my brother and sister to take them to the senior class. So this was largely a product of too many children and not enough cars. I was not allowed to do martial arts. So I just fought with my brother at home when he came home, basically every night from when I was about 9 until I was kind of in my mid-teens. So he would teach me wrestling and pressure points, and we would just spar. And he had a friend whose dad owned a Chinese video store who'd just bring home like low-quality pirated Chinese martial arts movies, and we would just watch them all weekend. I was just obsessed with Jackie Chan and Jet Li, and I kept at my parents all through sort of my early teens about doing jiu-jitsu. And they still were very firm that I had to be bigger and stronger before that. I think they just thought I was going to eventually have a growth spurt, and I just never did. So out of rebellion, I took up karate because I could get myself to the karate class down the road. And I did karate for probably, I guess, 8 or 9 years. And I met my now husband there doing that. And we were in our late teens by that stage. and he had a car, so I convinced him we should go do jiu-jitsu as well. And then we sort of merged. I stole him away from karate, and
that was a good move. That's a very good move.
Yeah. So we trained in jiu-jitsu together as training partners all the way through to getting our black belts. And we now run a club together down the road, and our kids and my niece and nephew train with us in our junior class, and so it's like a whole family thing now. But like over the years, I've done a whole bunch of, like, if I had unlimited time, I would just do all of the martial arts. So I've done Kabuto and Tai Chi and BJJ. I really love BJJ, but I've never sort of been able to keep doing it for a sustained period long enough. But yeah, like Alex, it's just such a, grappling is so magical in that you can feel so completely helpless. And when you're a smaller person with bigger people as well, just the sheer joy that you come from moving a much larger person in a way that shouldn't be possible if it is very fun.
Just the
so yeah, no, I don't know. It was the sport that I was always into. I just really, it's just fun, right? Like it's, I don't know. It never felt like work to me. I always really just love it.
And that's, I mean, I love that story because it's like, it's so ingrained in your family, but at the same time, it's like a really good karate movie or really good like martial arts movie. You overcame the challenges that people were denying you the ability to fulfill your dreams, and then you did it. You found your husband.
The challenge of getting 5 suburbs over. Yeah.
Exactly. It was fantastic. Cool. And Kay, what about you? What's your personal history with martial arts, and what does it mean to you?
I love how everyone here is saying like we started in nerdy ways, because I too wanted to be a turtle when I was little.
Yeah. Which was your favorite one, Kay?
Leonardo.
Okay. He's my second favorite. Raphael's my favorite.
I like
Are you-
Raphael.
Yeah, Raphael's my boy. Yeah. Sorry, Kay.
Yeah, so I was really nerdy, like the kind of kid who didn't go outside. I just read and watched movies, and I didn't have siblings. So one of my uncles was an Aikido instructor back in our home province in Bicol. So he started expressing concern that, I was starting to get really pale and like all drooped, and I don't go out. Like, so he's like, we have to train this kid. And like I said, he was a high-ranking master in the school back in Bicol. I think he was like the second at the top. He was close friends with the founder of Aikido in our home province. So he asked one of their students to actually personally train me. So I was getting like a one-on-one instruction with like one of their students who she was like in her 20s at the time, and I was a little kid. So the way that the school worked is that they didn't want us training in a dojo as much as possible. So basically, I was being trained outside in the hot asphalt under the hot sun.
In parking lots, yeah.
In parking lots with cars like just running by us, and that was how the school prided itself in. It didn't like their ideology is that there's no trophies, there's no like they don't even do it for profit. I don't think we paid for this school. It was for self-defense. That was their thing. And so it wasn't easy training in the heat, like wearing the whole gi and everything, but that's I remember that. So we would train every week, and this little nerdy kid learned to do exercises, and was like I was all bruised up because they didn't believe in being light on you. They just you just train your body. It's not so much about so there was not a lot of sparring involved. It was a lot of of exercises, meditation. So it was very interesting. Like I stopped practicing when we came to Canada, because like I didn't think I could find an experience the way, like a dojo experience the way I had it there. So it was a very like formative part of my years that like it just brings me closer to home when I think of martial arts, because of the whole connection with my uncle and my like my home province and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. I just when you told me on Twitter on the DM that it's just like we were training in parking lots, I'm just like picturing in my head a bunch of young Filipino kids like practicing in a parking lot, and there's just
So it was just me and like my instructor's roommates. So it's
really
like four young women.
okay. I was imagining way more
Practicing
people
in a
than this.
No, it was just us. Like one time we were meditating and some guys were even trying to sneak up on us. And my instructor just gave them like the stare down, and then they went away.
Oh, amazing! So
It was
cool.
very real world,
Yeah,
application.
yeah. I was gonna say it's like no, we got to train in the real world and see how it can be applied to everyday life. You know.
I think Kay's origin story is the most badass.
Yeah, for sure.
Except I had the whole nerd thing going on. Like I had big glasses.
No, but that doesn't matter. It's like that's like your Clark Kent identity versus your badass training in a parking lot identity. You just take the glasses off and boom.
My instructor was like, she was really badass. Like I felt safe just training with her. She was amazing.
Oh, that's great. And Fonda, Sam, you're mentioning old martial arts movies and stuff like that. I grew up on things like Jackie Chan. I remember seeing Rumble in the Bronx and then realizing that it was filmed in Vancouver, and I was just like, holy shit, and lost my mind. And I love Jackie Chan and Project A and all this stuff, and and then Jet Li and Chow Yun Fat and all the hard boiled and those kinds of Hong Kong cinema is fantastic. But I was curious if any of you have ever seen or had ever seen, earlier on in your life, martial arts actually appearing in science fiction or fantasy. So, Sam, I'll start with you.
I don't know. Now that you say that, it's always been something I've seen more of in a visual form than in written form, and maybe that's not true. Maybe it's more that it's more memorable in visual form, because I find even as someone who really loves martial arts, it's more fun to watch it, right? Like it's much easier to watch a really cool fight scene, and I find fight scenes that you can actually watch on TV, generally speaking, way more memorable than written ones, if only just because I'm not. Maybe it's how I read, but I'm not the kind of reader who kind of has the film going in their head kind of readings. I'm not hugely visual, so I strongly prefer watching martial arts on TV. I'm just trying to think if I can think of any kind of early books that I read in my youth that would have had martial arts in them. You have to come back to me. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
No worries. Has anyone else thought of something or anything that they can remember that had martial arts in sci-fi or fantasy? Fonda, you're nodding.
Well, for me, The Matrix was a formative movie in my life. That was, I remember going and seeing The Matrix in the theaters, and the part where like Neo is plugged into the Matrix, and he opens his eyes and he's like, I know Kung Fu. And I was like, oh man, if only it was that easy. Like I would like to download Kung Fu into my brain too. But like that whole experience of like portraying martial arts in such a stylistic, compelling, like never before seen on the screen kind of way in this like futuristic sci-fi landscape. I just like that movie just burned its way into my brain, and was very formative for me as a storyteller later on. And the other place where I really saw martial arts in science fiction fantasy were wuxia novels. So in my teens, my dad introduced me to the whole genre of wuxia because Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out, and I loved that movie. And it was like the first time that I had seen martial arts in this kind of fantasy depiction of it, right? Like people running up walls and kind of like jumping through flying through the bamboo forest. And my dad was like, you know, if you like that, there's like an entire genre of fiction. So that's when I discovered like the Jin Yong novels and got into wuxia fiction. So I had consumed quite a bit of martial arts in science fiction and fantasy before I started writing it.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, we'll get into that. The Legend of the Condor series is fantastic. I've read the first 2 books, and I think it's like they've only translated a certain number, so I'm just kind of like
They're up
waiting
to
for
4
them to
now.
translate more. Perfect.
So the
All
fourth
right.
one
I got 2
think
books.
came out recently,
Nice.
and it was they actually sent. I think it was either the third or fourth. The fourth book, they sent it to me to blurb, and I was like, I'm blurbing Jin Yong. Like this is wild. So I've actually blurbed this novel that
It's all come full circle, Fonda.
Yes.
Cool. And Kay, have you thought of any sci-fi or fantasy, fiction or films that you remember seeing martial arts in?
Well, growing up, I was like really into anime and manga, so that's mostly my exposure to martial arts in that context. I also remember watching those like really old kung fu movies that have like the bad dubbing, and I
Yes.
can't remember it, like, but I just vaguely remember watching them a lot when I was little. But in terms of fiction, I think Fonda's books were the first one I encountered. Yeah, in like Western novels.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And yeah, I mean, anime for me was one of those big ones too. It's like I grew up on Dragon Ball, and I just loved that series so much. But now that I've gotten older, it's like cool just to see like the breadth, to see all of you writing your stuff, and just to see that martial arts is getting more representation in this in these genres. And Alex, I'll toss it over to you as well if you remember anything from when you were younger about seeing martial arts in SFF.
Yeah, so as far as like what we consider martial arts, I don't think I really had very much reading as far as outside of what everyone else is talking about, movies, anime. I feel like everything I was exposed to was kind of a mix. I had exposure to some anime as a kid, and then just like American Western cartoons like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm.
But I think subconsciously somewhere in my brain, a lot of the science fiction fantasy I was reading kind of melded with martial arts, in that I think martial arts, the kind of the hero's journey that you see, the standard trope of master and student, or just of a warrior becoming better and learning new techniques, is something that you do see like so often in standard fantasy. Like I was reading a lot of R.A. Salvatore, and I think not consciously, but I think my brain subconsciously was connecting a lot of those things, like whether it's unarmed combat or swords or magic. It all seemed to be very similar to me, especially when I started watching a lot of like Jet Li movies in high school. I went down this Jet Li. I was just in my basement watching Jet Li for like
That's a good
probably
rabbit
several
hole.
months. Fist of Legend. I think I watched that movie like 30 times over and over. And I think, again, subconsciously now thinking back on it, I think a lot of that kind of clicked with like, wait, this is kind of like fantasy. This is the same tropes that you see. And I think that connected a lot for me. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's cool because nowadays we're seeing things like, I don't know if it really exists that much in traditional publishing, but in self-publishing, there's this whole sort of subgenre called progression fantasy. And it's kind of the idea of like a character, very character driven, but they're progressing and acquiring skills through, just the overcoming of challenges and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of the time it involves combat and things like that. So it's kind of cool. It's like martial arts films, a lot of the time it's like Karate Kid's a progression. Well, it's not a progression fantasy, it's a progression reality. But it's cool to see that different genres are sort of pulling from each other, and there is this sort of intermingling of ideas, like you were saying, Alex. And Sam, I'll toss this to you. You know, once you started writing, at which point did you then realize, or conversely consciously decide, holy crap, I can incorporate martial arts into my fiction, you know? And can you briefly describe how you've done that? And then at the same time, tell us a bit about that initial process, because I know this is something that is very difficult, because you mentioned it yourself, translating real combat experience to the page to make it as not necessarily comparatively engaging to films, but engaging in its own way.
Yeah, so I'm probably the odd one out here a little bit, because I wrote a series of books in which my characters are kind of actively not fighters. So they are largely trying to solve problems with thinking and talking and puzzling things out, and they're not sort of trained fighters, which doesn't mean that I didn't incorporate martial arts into it, but it did mean that I didn't have the kind of classic, your protagonist is a really awesome martial artist or swordswoman or whatever.
Yeah.
So for me, the kind of the martial arts aspects meant making the fights that occurred with basically sort of mostly untrained characters, making them feel real based on my experiences of how people fight in what certain circumstances. So most of the kind of actual proper serious combat in my books is sort of between armies, or as a poisoning sort of quiet murdery sort of way, but there are a range of situations that my protagonists get in where they have to get themselves out, and I had a lot of fun making those scenes work from a martial arts point of view, in terms of, is this something a person could do, and I made my husband, you know, role play some of the scenes out to make sure they work. So I had a lot of fun in doing that. But yeah, for me, it was about making things feel authentic to a person who knows how fights tend to work in real life, which is something that, you know, many readers probably couldn't give a crap about, but it's certainly something that I feel when I'm reading. I really, because I don't get the same buzz out of reading a martial arts fight as I do seeing one. For me, the thing that resonates when I read good martial arts fiction is feeling that stuff works, and that the person has really thought about it, and they're not just describing a series of moves, but they are incorporating character, and like that's the advantage you get when you're writing versus visualizing. You don't get the kind of flashy visual effect, but you have the opportunity to have the character, you know, you're responding to things emotionally, and you get the sense of how they're feeling rather than just seeing it. So yeah, for me it was about realism, and you know, I'm very very aware what it's like being the less strong, less fast person in a fight. So that worked out for me quite nicely in sort of imagining how a character who's less skilled could get out of something realistically. So that's sort of what I work in terms of doing my fiction. The thing that I'm writing now, I have more competent characters, which is more fun in some ways, to actually write fight scenes where they know what they're doing. But
more physically competent, not necessarily.
Yeah, more physically competent. Yeah.
Yeah, but I read in a Reddit AMA of yours that you mock fight with your husband to sort of get the feel for it, and I was just like, oh, I love that. That's awesome. Like,
yeah, well, sometimes it's just like,
fight with me
could this realistically work? Like,
yeah. But you hit on two things there that I really like. It's like, there's the internality of it, and I think that's something all of you really nail with fighting, is that there's the character's emotional and psychological mental reactions to things just as much as there is the physical flow of combat, and I think that is super, super important. And then at the same time, it's like, we'll touch on this a little bit later in terms of like things like pacing and action, but you know, Sam, you mentioned, you know, what it's like to be the underdog in a situation, and I think that's the kind of circumstance where it's like, cool, there's some real tension in this scene, and it works because this person's trying to figure out how to overcome their opponent, and that in a sense is like, that's what engages me in written combat, versus something like visual combat where, like you say, it's like flashy and boom, 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 and and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, they're just traipsing through branches like it's nothing. It's like, oh man. But yeah, I love that. And Kay, what about you? What's sort of your when did you realize that you wanted to incorporate martial arts into your fiction, and how have you gone about that? And then at the same time, how did you translate your history with martial arts into the written page?
So I don't think it was so much the actual like martial arts, but the way I think when you're in the situation that my characters find themselves in, which is like a lot of danger, and you're in a narrow street and you don't know what's around the corner. I draw a lot of that from, like, I grew up in the slums in Manila, and when I was little, like it wasn't the safest neighborhood. Like, I wasn't really allowed to go out and mingle with the other kids, but I did it anyway, and we got into some fights. I may have pushed one child off a bicycle one time. it's like it was really like
Badass Kay just
would
coming to
gather
the surface.
they would gather in gangs, and then they would pick on my cousin. So I think I threw rocks at another kid once. It was very like it was a lot of chaos, and I used that, like, especially in the Wolf of Oren-Yaro, when you have this pampered, spoiled like queen, and she finds herself in that environment. And I just kind of went nuts with all like the trash talking, and the feeling of danger, and everyone's you don't know what everyone's motivation is. Is this person gonna like kidnap you and sell you for parts? It's so it has that very realistic, like, just the anxiety, and that's mostly what I use. Like, a lot of the fights, if you notice, they're over pretty fast. So it like I tend to focus more on the heightened, like, the tension, because I feel like that's where a lot of the drama, like the potential for drama, is, and then the actual fights may be over in like a page or so.
Yeah, and there is a lot
Yeah.
of incorporating blades into that. Just like, I'm just gonna stab
Yeah.
you, man.
Yeah. Like, I couldn't stab those annoying bullies, but
In my imagination, I can do whatever I want.
yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. And Alex, what about you and your Combat Code series? How did you kind of come to the decision or realization that you wanted to write this series? And then how'd you go about it? And at the same time, what was it like translating all your personal history with the martial arts into the books?
Yeah, I mean, the series really originated from kind of a single concept that I had, which was, what if wars were replaced by one-on-one combat, unarmed combat? Just because, I've always been a big fan of mixed martial arts in general, and I love swords, I love magic, but I just wanted to create a world where those weapons were negated. And so I from that seed, I had to really create a whole political system and world that revolved around single combat. And it actually, lately with current events and that sort of thing, there's been that I think I've seen things online where people have been like challenging each other to duels and stuff like that, which would probably never work in the real world, but I was thinking of that.
We're not Andrew Jacksons here. No.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at its core, it's kind of like, although it would never work in the real world, it's kind of just the idea of how much easier would it be if people could just solve their problems by, fighting, not even necessarily to the death, but I know a lot of people who, whether it be students of mine or friends that have a lot of aggression, and then after they're able to, release that aggression, they're often much nicer people, and oftentimes things that can be solved, via a duel, so to speak.
It's just like, get that release, and then cooler heads can prevail afterwards,
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think as far as the internal monologue for combat is of course really really important. Even if you watch whether it be movies or sports or as far as martial arts, mixed martial arts, things like UFC. I mean, uh, even if you're very knowledgeable about what's going on, it's not necessarily the most exciting thing unless you know the backgrounds of the characters, the
Mm,
fighters, and that's why these companies spend so much time talking about the backstories. And you can go
yeah.
all sports, right? You go into the backstories of the characters, and that is really what sports and especially martial arts, because it's human versus human, to some sort of submission, whatever the sport might be. And it's really the characters and their backstories and their history with each other which make it interesting. And I think that does give fiction kind of the upper hand in some cases, although we're not able to visually show as much, and we don't want to just like vomit out action onto the page. I think it
Yeah.
gives us the advantage of getting, just like everything, getting inside the character's head, and providing that inner monologue that fighters have.
Hmm. No, yeah, that's great because it's like, yeah, the internality creates the connection, and like I didn't really ever think about it, but when you said that, a lot of the times when people connect with like a sports player or a UFC fighter or what have you, there's this kind of um I wouldn't necessarily call it like glorification of someone's history, but it's sort of like pumping it up in the sense that their personal story is almost like their own personal hero's journey kind of thing, and then that is used as a marketing tool to create more empathy between the participants of the sport and the people who are watching at home, the fans and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And Fonda, what about you when it comes to, you have Zeroboxer, which is more science fiction, and then you have the Green Bone Saga. How did you go about deciding that you wanted to incorporate martial arts into your fiction, and then at the same time translating it onto the page?
For me, it was pretty much immediate. When I started writing, there were martial arts in my stories. Before I wrote my debut, Zeroboxer, I wrote an entire um, fantasy novel that's trunked, that's never going to see the light of day, that I queried, but did get picked up. And that was a fantasy with martial arts in it. And then with Zeroboxer, it came to me. The concept of zero gravity MMA came to me, and that was like the seed of the entire book. At the time, I was working in corporate strategy at Nike, and so I had a really front row seat to exactly some of the things that you were talking about, the building up of athletes and the backstory, and how much the story of the athlete and the journey of the athlete becomes a marketing tool and a rallying cry for an entire population, whether that's like a high school sports team to like Olympic, national level competition. So I wanted to write a story that kind of delved into that and the pressure on the athlete who becomes the symbol for an entire group of people who are rooting for them. And was like, well, clearly the sport that I know best is martial arts, and so I'm going to write the story about this martial artist who's an athlete who comes to represent all of Earth in this futuristic sci-fi story. So that's how I ended up with a debut novel, and then at each of my books has had martial arts feature pretty prominently in it. But it's always interesting because when people ask me, well, to what extent did your experience help you write those? On one hand, it helped me a lot, but on the other, it didn't, because every single one of my fictional martial arts has had such a speculative element to it that there were so many things that I had to research and make up. So, like, to my knowledge, no one has ever had an MMA match in space in zero gravity. So I had to make all that stuff up, and that
Not
included
yet.
things like. And at the time that I was writing it, I hadn't done any grappling. I'd done plenty of striking in my life, But writing that book is one of the things that got me into training jujitsu, because I was learning like this whole sort of other side of fighting that I wasn't personally familiar with. Plus, at the same time, I was doing things like watching, astronauts on the International Space Station bounce around and trying to like understand how they moved and how that might translate if they were fighting, and even things like how lifeguards would hold on to drowning victims, because that's kind of like a weightless environment. So I was taking all these things, and partially my experience, partially my research, and partially just sheer imagination, and mashing them together. With the Green Bone Saga, there's tons of knife fights in that series, and I'm not a knife fighter.
All over the place.
So tons of knives everywhere, and I'm not, a knife fighter. I don't have that background. I have background in other martial arts, but the amount of knife fighting YouTube videos I have watched, so like the mindset of a martial artist has helped me a lot. But in every single case, I've taken that martial art and added such a speculative layer to it, that I've taken that kind of foundation that I have personally and then brought other things into it. And something to, like Sam earlier said, that most of the time when you think of fight scenes, you think of screen fight scenes, things that you see on film, because it's just so much more like visually immediate and compelling. And the way I think about writing martial arts scenes in fiction is that I'm not there to compete with that. Like it doesn't make any sense to try and write out a movie fight scene on the page, because if I wanted to see a movie fight scene, I would just watch a movie with a fight scene in it. So I have to lean into the strengths of the tools that we have as prose writers, right? Yeah. And that is the personal stakes and the internality and the ability to leverage the reader's imagination. Because ideally, you don't want to write every move onto the page. What you want is to create the feel of that conflict so that the reader sees it in their own mind, and you're asking the reader to do work to create that movie scene in their own head. And you have to that's kind of this delicate balance where you need to say enough so that they fill in the gaps, but you're not like, you're not blow by blow breaking down a scene on the page, because that would be very technical and very boring.
It's like emulation to the point of satisfying the format of text, but then also, like you said, making the reader work a little bit, because that's the deal when you're a reader. It's like the writer is setting something up for the reader's imagination to take it to the next level, and obviously add their own little twists. And you're not going to put every blow by blow by blow. The readers are going to pick up on the rhythm of what your combat or your fight scene is like, and they're going to start filling it in, and they're going to, based on how you set things up, this is kind of a perfect jumping off point, Fonda, in terms of things like pacing and tension. You have the control as the author to work with those tools, and then the reader gets the feel for that pacing and that tension, and then obviously they'll fill in the blanks, and they'll add a few extra punches and kicks and grapples or whatever the hell comes to their head. And so Kate, I'll toss this to you first. Fonda, you were mentioning what tools the writer has to present a fight scene that works for the format, versus a film which has the added benefit of visuals, but then there's so much cool stuff that written fiction can do, and I wanted to get your take on how your personal experience with martial arts, how your knowledge of it adds to your sci-fi and fantasy stories. Kay, in your case, your fantasy stories of things like pacing and action, but also characters. We've talked about internality a little bit, but also things like world building. So
like it's the way that I learned martial arts. There was a lot of downtime, I guess. Like we always started out with like 5-10 minutes of meditation, and then a lot of it is very like self-paced exercises. So in a way, I had a lot of time to think.
Mhm.
So I think it kind of so the way I write is it's very very deep character driven. Like so it's so almost obsessively internal
Mhm.
the way they think. So it's almost like sometimes like the action stops while the character is thinking. And so that's kind of how I pace it. I know that so some people might find it a little slow, but to me it's since the journey is about the character, it like every action they make is supporting like the story in their head. So they do a strike. Why did they strike that person in a specific way? It's usually supported by their internal struggle. So and then the way I world build, I always world build around the character, so it kind of spreads out. So it's always character first, and then it just spreads out to their actions, and then it spreads out to like the world that's supporting these characters' arc. So that's kind of how I approach it. It's so I don't let the character take action that doesn't necessarily support their journey, the
Mhm.
character driven journey that they're taking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like when I write, I end up cutting out a lot of paragraphs where they're just like doing action, but it doesn't support the internal struggle. I have to like you know throw it out.
Yeah. But I think that's good that you have this own your own personal hierarchy in terms of, character is key and everything has to support that. And I think it's really important for, action scenes not to exist just for the sake of like, oh, there's like a lack of excitement in this particular chapter. Let me just add a fight scene. Fonda, I think we've spoken before about how uh regardless of what it is, in terms of a fight scene, in terms of dialogue or whatever, you have to place your characters in a situation that adds to multiple elements at once, whether it's the character's own uh personal journey, or their relationships to other characters, whether it's the world itself, and the action, if it has consequence, then that consequence is felt. The repercussions are felt throughout the narrative, and all of you do a really good job of this, of giving your characters purpose when it comes to their action. It's not just like, this part's boring, let me just toss some shit in there and hope people get excited. It's like, no, these fights mean something and there's growth in there in some particular way. So Sam, I'll toss it to you, the same question that I gave Kay.
So I mean, yeah, I mean, you're completely right. The way that fight scenes work in books has to be like anything else in the story, and that it has to serve the story, and it can't just be there because you think, well, crap, I've had my characters sitting around talking for a couple of pages, which I'm particularly
Flip a
guilty of.
table and have them fight. It's all good.
So yeah, and I mean, look, fighting like anything else is an amazing way of bringing in world building and character, because everything about a fight scene is connected to the world and how characters fight and what they use to fight with. And I don't just mean in terms of weapons, but also in terms of what you're using in there. You don't just want to have your characters fighting in a vacuum unless it's literally an arena.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if your action's taking place in a kind of an unplanned way, then then you can incorporate the elements of the place that they're in, and what they're wearing. I mean, I'm sure we all know like fighting is quite different. Those of us who've sort of done wrestling type things, like the difference between no gi BJJ versus gi BJJ, like the moves, the things that you can do are quite different. So what people wear is important, and even dumb things like their footwear and hairstyles and stuff can be like one thing that I find really, as a woman in particular, I find very frustrating is watching martial art type things where the women have their hair going everywhere, and I just like as a fighter,
unwieldy. It doesn't work.
It genuinely hurts. If you are grappling with someone with loose hair, it hurts so much all the time when your hair gets pinned. It's like a dumb little thing that people don't kind of sometimes you've got these elements that look cool, but if you've actually done these things in person, you want to know how that really feels when you're actually doing it, because like you say, you've got the internality, which means that your character's experiencing what they would actually experience. So those all sort of things help you can build your world into them. And yeah, as part of the story elements, the fights can't just be meaningless action. They have to enhance or resolve tension, or create new problems, or solve them. They have to be doing something for the story. But I just think that's like any other part of a book. Like a fight scene shouldn't be a separate kind of scene. It should be like anything else. You're either telling the reader the answer to something, or you're creating a new question for them to keep them going, or both, ideally.
Yeah. And if a character does have long hair, I mean, it's maybe they don't know about fighting. You can incorporate that and just show how shitty it is to have long hair.
Unless that flowing hair is getting like caught in something, or just pinned by yourself. Like I used to have very long hair, obviously no hair now, but I used to have very long hair, and wrestling it's a legitimate problem because you pin it yourself. It gets pinned behind your shoulders when you're on your back. It's always a genuine problem. You can't move your head because you're pinned down by your hair. Anyway, that is a dumb small thing. I just feel like martial artists, and what I said before about martial arts and nerds, it's a genuine thing, because I think that martial arts, sports in general, martial arts maybe in particular, because it has that sort of link to someone who's maybe, like, we get a lot of people in jiu-jitsu, probably a higher proportion than most sports, of people who aren't good at other sports. And I think that's partly because martial arts aren't, especially the kinds that I've traditionally done. Maybe it's slightly different in, boxing or the pure sort of striking ones. But you get people who are natural athletes who come in and aren't immediately good at it, because a lot of these things are very specific, precise movements that just take repetition to get the muscle memory out. And a lot of kids who are normally very athletic and really good at sports get frustrated quickly and quit. And a lot of kids who aren't necessarily good at other sports do persist. And so I reckon we have a higher proportion of nerds. And so there's that kind of overlap between, like the traditional, underdog kid who's not good at sports slowly becoming good. And I think that that lends itself to the fictional journey, hero's journey kind of tradition as well. So yeah, I think there's like the role of martial arts and combat in stories kind of has that natural starting out in one place, ending in a different place story that works well for fiction as well as in real life.
Yeah, I agree. And that
Sam, you just said so many things that
sorry, go ahead, Alex.
That I agree with. There's so many things there. Like if you ever watched like women's judo or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or even men who have long hair, they have to reset so many times just to like redo the hair bun. and it's true as far as nerdy.
Lots of BJJ girls with the two braids, because that's the most secure hairstyle.
Yeah, no, like I'm still learning to do my girls. I have 3 girls at home, and I'm still learning to do their hair. But I think when I have to do their hair for grappling, it's going to be a whole different. You really have to have a tight hair game for that, literally.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Alex, as far as the nerdiness, it's 100% true. Yeah, especially with the uniform. A lot of I do both gi as well as no gi, and no gi we tend to get more like wrestlers and athletes. But especially in the gi, you tend to get people that were non-athletes, and the uniform itself frustrates a lot of people who are quite athletic because it slows things down. It makes it a lot more calculating. You're able to kind of plan your tricks ahead of time, and I think that frustrates people that are typically quite athletic. End of the day, I mean, obviously athleticism is a big asset. But
obviously.
But there is a bonus to being able to approach something with a little bit more of the mental athleticism in combination with, like an increasing physical athleticism, as time goes on. It's like not all nerds have to be scrawny, they can eventually build some muscle. And Alex, since we're on you anyways, if you want to jump on the same topic, just about how you've used your knowledge of martial arts in order to tackle things like pacing and tension, world building, and characters and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think as far as my actual martial arts experience on the mats or doing whatever martial arts, Muay Thai, karate, kung fu, it certainly comes in handy as far as describing some of the action. But as most of the other people here have said, I think it's more so the internal, pacing as well as the character building that is what I take to what I write. Even for example, watching a ton of mixed martial arts, like I don't have enough time to watch anything anymore. And as far as like UFC, it's tough for me to watch nowadays just because it's so late, and I go to bed early with little kids. It sounds like I can't stay up late enough. But I used to watch a ton, especially if any of you guys have seen, like, in Japan they used to have this event called Pride, which was, if
Yeah,
you guys haven't seen it, you should go
it's
back and watch some of those
fantastic.
Pride events. It's the production of them. It's like the way they would put on a tournament where people would compete like 4 times in a night, or over a period of a week, and they would have like just the way the Japanese fans are so educated about martial arts, and they would never boo, and they would, even on a pin drop, you could hear a pin drop, um, during those events, and they would, very technical things they would like cheer for. But that sort of thing, the character introductions, and just the mindset of a fighter, I think is what I take more from my martial arts experience, both being on the mats and interacting with a ton of fighters and martial arts, and just seeing how they look at the world. And it is a very unique worldview. You really get a myriad of types of characters. And I think people look at fighters as one type of person, but there there is a lot of different, there's, every personality you could imagine are the type of peoples that end up in martial arts. So I really think that's more so what I take. And then of course, describing in the combat codes, there's quite a bit of martial arts, of course. And so describing the techniques is a big part of it. But I would say more so the fighter's mindset.
Hmm. Yeah, and that is something that we'll get into. I wanted to dig in a little bit to the sort of like mindset, spiritual, holistic side of martial arts. But Fonda, we'll get your take on sort of like pacing and tension, world building, character, that kind of stuff, how you use your martial arts knowledge to enhance those aspects.
Yeah. Well, there are definitely times when there's a technique or something that I have learned, or that I'll be, in class, and there'll be something where I'm like, I'm going to use that. So there are definitely those times when it is like a literal translation of something that I've learned or that I know, and I find a place for it in the manuscript, and that always feels great. And what's even greater is when your instructor my Sifu read Jade City and was like, oh yeah, yeah, I saw like what you did in that scene, like so there's those
Yeah.
moments. But I think on a more high level, one thing that being a martial artist teaches you is that martial arts is a journey, not a destination, and that it is such it's a lot like writing, actually. I think they're two of the
Yes.
most um of some masochistic like endeavors that you can sign up for, because there's never any point at which you feel like you're good at this, like, ever, really, with writing
Mhm.
and martial arts, right? You're constantly searching for that incremental bit of improvement, and you think that you've got it, and, like, maybe you get your black belt and you're like, yeah, you get your book deal and you're like, yeah, I've made it. But, like, no, that's just the start of this whole other level that you unlock. And so I think how that translates for me onto the page is that the action is never contained in just that scene. It is the action scene, the fight scene is also a character scene. So when we talk about fight scenes, and writing them, I always try to tell people, when I talk about writing those scenes, that there's not a dichotomy between your character scenes and your fight scenes. Your fight scenes should be a character scene. Like the fight itself shapes that person, that character, and that in fact that's like the most pure character scene that there is, when you have a character who is up against the wall and has to resort to physical violence. That's where you really learn the truth about that character. So I think of character and action as being very holistic, as being one thing. And every fight scene should feel like you understand why this is happening and why this character is in this situation and how they're feeling and what is at stake for them. I mentioned earlier about world building, that all of my martial arts has this like has such a speculative side to it. But one of the things that I think being a martial artist brings to writing action scenes in a speculative setting is the ability to make them feel grounded and to feel realistic. That was really my goal with the Green Bone Saga. Was I watched these movies where you see the kung fu masters like run up walls and do all these great feats, and I wanted to write that with the mentality of a martial artist, so that those characters who have those powers, when you read about what they're doing, it still feels very grounded. It still feels like this is a real physical thing that they're doing that feels real, and they could get hurt, and that hurt. And there's this the sweat and the adrenaline that's associated with that. So bringing that sort of groundedness to a speculative fiction setting, and the combat of a speculative fiction setting is like, it's almost like the opposite in many ways of what you see on film sometimes, because you get those big MCU tentpole blockbuster films where the fighting doesn't feel like it's dangerous. It doesn't feel as physical because there's so much CGI. And that's kind of like the opposite of what I want to do, like as a martial artist writing prose speculative fiction.
Yeah, it's like there's just so much there's so much going on, and there's just like a bunch of bullshit eye candy that nothing really feels like it has stakes, and the stakes, it's like it can be super intimate in the sense that it's like one-on-one combat between a certain person, but it's like, no, those Marvel movies just take it way, way too far in terms of taking out the raw physicality of actually being involved in an altercation with another person, whether it's by choice or not, And Fonda, you brought up the sort of like go ahead, Sam. No, go.
No, I was going to say, it is a contrast to the sort of Marvel fight scenes where I completely agree with Fonda, where often things just don't feel real or grounded. One of my favorite martial arts scenes is just a short fight scene in a movie called Grosse Pointe Blank. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's a fantastic movie, but it's
a good one.
A scene.
That's one of the best.
It's so good. There's a scene where John Cusack and Benny the Jet are fighting in a high school corridor with lockers and things, and it's such a good fight scene, and it feels so real and so brutal, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I found out later that that's an unscripted fight scene, and Benny the Jet and John Cusack run a martial arts school together, which I was like, what?
So cool.
And yeah, they're really good friends, and they run this school together. And this was just a scene of them just wailing on each other in the corridor. And I was like, that's just a pure example of how sometimes like big flashy moves and things that are done visually to make the fight look great on screen sometimes don't actually look as good as two people just genuinely going at each other in a realistic way. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's also, I think it's in the first season of Daredevil, where there's really good corridor fight scene.
It's another corridor. Corridors are great for fights.
Corridors are fucking great for fights, man. But it's like it just like confines the situation and the environment that there's no way to avoid potential brutality, and a lot of the times it does come down to brutality. But Fonda, as you mentioned, and Alex, I brought up when you were last speaking about the more like holistic side of nature, the holistic nature of martial arts, and how it can sort of more broadly play into a fighter's greater outlook on life. And Kay, you mentioned earlier when you were doing Aikido in the parking lot and stuff, you're doing meditation. Excuse me. And so there's the spiritual side to martial arts as well. And I think that's really important because it's like it's the fighter's mindset, but the fighter's mindset doesn't necessarily just apply to a specific arena. It can broaden out into a greater outlook on life and, relationships and all kinds of different aspects. So, Kay, I'll start with you, since you were speaking about it earlier in terms of meditation and that kind of thing. You know, how does martial art practice, or how did it play into your spirituality, and how does that kind of continued into your outlook on life? And, does it appear in your stories as well? And if so, what does it add to the nature of it?
So the school that trained me, it was actually like it emphasized the spiritual holistic side of martial arts, like to a frightening degree. Basically, you can get thrown out of the school for not, subscribing to these ideals, because the way the founder wanted to emphasize on is that, you're not there to beat people up. It's self-defense. It's supposed to get you out of dangerous situations. And so basically, you don't get into fights for points. You don't get into fights for trophies. It was one of those schools that, like, it was almost, you know they this was very important. Like, the mindset was very important. So, like, before we started the exercises, there would be like this story time where they would talk about, the people who were bragging, and then they disabled them from just with like two or three quick moves. And so it stuck with me because this was my formative years. Like, I would think I was 10 or something, and then it just stuck with me that, like, you can learn to fight but not actually, look for fights.
Hmm.
So the way that translated, like into my writing, I actually really started to question how a lot of fiction or a lot of stories, they see violence as the means to an end, right? Like we were talking about the Marvel movies, like they just do destruction, like they just wreck the city because this guy was wrong.
And it's like,
And
how many people died there, man? Like,
I do like that they started to, like, question that too, right?
yeah.
That's like in the later media.
Hmm.
So, you know overall, the way I approach my writing is that, is this aggression necessary? And so usually, if I do end up writing a violent fight, it's usually because the character is trying to get out and they're not being allowed to get out. And, it's like, with the exception of bad guys, the bad guys, I really go nuts with the show of power with the bad guys, because it's fun. But the framing of it, the framing of all the scenes, is I seem to go back to how I was taught from the very beginning. It's that, is this necessary? You train and you get strong so that you don't, like somebody else can't hurt you. You can get out of a bad situation. Like, you use your environment to your advantage so that you can remove the thing that could hurt you.
Yeah, and despite being a very capable character, she's a queen, and so people kind of underestimate her and that kind of thing. But she's never the one that's outright instigating, much of the violence. It's all being impressed upon her, but then she's still, using her physical capability, her mental capability to outwit her opponents, and, like you say, use the environment to come out on top. Yeah, and I really
Yeah.
really like that about it. Cool. And Alex, since I brought it up with you earlier, if you want to get in on the whole spiritual, holistic side of martial arts and how it, plays into your life, but as well as your fiction.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I've had an evolution with that over the past 20 years, where I think what, mixed martial arts and essentially, creating the UFC and these major fighting leagues, where essentially it became a sport, a very prominent global sport, is it dispelled a lot of the spirituality, which I think it had a lot of positives as well as some negatives. we've all seen the videos that are kind of sad of like literally old grandmasters that think they have some sort of spiritual chakra power fighting a mixed martial art fighter, and them actually believing they can send a energy wave to them, and then them getting beat up, which is actually quite sad, but also I think very enlightening as far as how delusional people can get as well as students. And I think one thing that mixed martial arts as well as Brazilian jiu-jitsu has done is helped kind of dispel some of the less less positive spiritual elements. But at the same time, I think it's kind of driven it in the opposite direction, where I do believe that there are a lot of spiritual elements that can be taken from martial arts that are extremely positive. I know for me personally, just the martial arts has given me so much from my work ethic and a lot of what Fonda was talking about, as far as there being no real end to the journey. All of those lessons and ways of life have had a really positive effect on my life. At the same time, when I'm teaching, I literally tell my students, listen to what I say about the techniques, what I'm teaching you. And this is my body type. This is how I do things. It might not work for you, but I'm teaching you what works for me. Don't listen to anything else I say. I'm literally an idiot. As far as you shouldn't listen. I mean, like, I'm like a blue belt
humble
parent, maybe blue belt 2-stripe parent. I know, I know a few other things, but I'm not someone that should be able to guide you in the various parts of your life. And I think that is a negative that has come from martial arts, as far as students looking up to their teachers so much, almost in a cult-like fashion, where they're getting guidance on every single thing, even if it's not necessarily good or expert guidance. So that being said, I think personally, martial arts does have a spiritual element for me, because it puts me in a place that is almost I feel like a child. It's almost like play. I think a lot of adults, when they get older, they don't learn. They've lost the ability to play. And for me, I see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I see grappling, I see martial arts as a form of play. And all things aside, self-defense aside, combat aside, I think mammals are creatures that when you watch young mammals or even older mammals, they play fight. They learn to play fight with each other. And evolutionarily, that's really good, because they can't injure each other too much. They need to learn the skills they need to learn, and they don't want to like hurt each other, because that would be they wouldn't be learning at that point. So I think adults, for me, being able to play, like I tell my kids, I'm going to play with my friends. And I actually think that has a big tie-in with writing for me. Or at least I try to embrace that childlike, just love of writing, where you're making up stories, you're playing with your figurines, you're telling a story in your head, and I have to constantly retell myself that's what I'm doing when I'm writing, so that I still love it. And even though it's becoming a bigger part of my life, and writing as a professional, I think, can be difficult, because you see it as a job, and that can take the fun out of it. So I think there is a tie in there, as far as martial arts as well as writing being, for me at least, a form of play, trying to kind of get back to that childlike nature.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, because it's like, now that I have my young son, I'm just kind of reigniting my sense of play, and just like the imagination that I have to convey in order for him to be excited and interacting with certain things. So it's like, his need for play is also reigniting my need for play, and then I get to do things like this podcast, and then writing as well. It's like, we should never lose that sense of childlike wonder and play that we have for so long, but then a lot of people end up losing it when they get into adulthood, and it's just kind of like, well, shit, I'm stuck in a corporate office job, and there's no there's no entry point for imagination or play fighting or any kind of stuff like that. And Sam, I'll toss it to you as well, just on the notion of the holistic side of martial arts, the spirituality, and how that plays into your life in fiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree with Alex about the play factor, because I just think it's it just has such a releasing, amazing effect, being able to
Mhm.
go from, a hard day in the office or whatever, and then just going and rolling around on the ground with people. It's what I was saying earlier. It's just, there's something about martial arts that's just inherently fun to me.
Yeah.
Now, I very much grew up with martial arts in a completely unspiritual way. So the only kind of examples of martial arts as a spirituality came from me watching media in which it was portrayed that way. So the ones that I did were never like that at all. So I had very limited experience. So the karate style that I did was very much, there was a lot of bowing, like an obscene amount of bowing, and a lot of, barking orders at people, and there's sort of a military kind of aspect to it, which I didn't love, because my early experiences have been shaped entirely with just mucking around with my brother and us just having a ball doing things, but there was kind of no sense of a deliberate hierarchy. And then when I switched to jiu-jitsu, it was such a contrast to me, because the club is so focused on practical self-defense, and there was no kind of sense of titles and bowing. My instructors were called Maka and Tuck. It was like a very different thing from the sensei and lots of bowing and things that I've experienced in karate. And that really appealed to me. And the way that we run our club is very relaxed, and we're not religious, and we don't have a sort of an overt spirituality associated with the martial arts. But having said that, I still think that even when you're taking it as an entirely unmystical thing, entirely as a self-defense, fun thing that you do, you still do learn, and the way that your instructors teach still has an important kind of psychological shaping, if not overtly spiritual. Like, you still learn things about how to use force responsibly and how to treat people, and how to be respectful, even if that's not about barking orders or titles or bowing or anything. You still learn how to treat people with respect, and you being aware of your body and how you can harm people, I think, is really important. And so, like, even though martial arts has been something I've always loved, and I love watching it and I love doing it, I'm not a violent person at all. And one of the things I was trying to explore in the Poison Wall books was our kind of tendency to try to craft fantasy novels around the idea that violence is the solution, and that you solve problems exclusively through violence. And I was kind of deliberately trying to write a story in which that wasn't the answer, and the way to solve the problems wasn't through being stronger or faster, or beating the other person physically. And that's hard, I think, because I think a lot of the time we're trained through the media that we consume, that especially American media, that you do win things by fighting. And it's a kind of weird dichotomy, because it's like, I love fighting. I love fighting so much. I love watching it. I love doing it. I'm teaching my kids that. But I think for me, it's always felt like a thing that you enjoy doing in a controlled, fun environment, and you would be able to do if you had to, but you wouldn't seek it out. And I think even when you're not teaching martial arts in an overtly spiritual way, you're still trying to convey that. And I think that still has an impact on how you think and feel about violence in general.
Yeah, I completely agree. You should go tell that to Will Smith, Sam. I think he would learn a thing or two. Fonda, I'll toss the same question to you, just in terms of your personal take on, the holistic spiritual sides of martial arts and how that plays into your writing.
Yeah. So I think for me, martial arts has always been a very mentally healthy place to be. There's so many things in your day-to-day life that can be very frustrating, and also so much of writing is very isolated and in your own head, and at, just sitting in your chair. And so martial arts has always been like that counterpoint to me. Like, whatever is going on that is frustrating, I can take it out like on the punching bags. You know, when I get to the dojo, like I
Hmm.
can purge some of that. You know, the energy that you have that's kind of like that builds up, and take that out in a safely violent way. You know, and that, like, I always come out of martial arts class feeling better. Even like on the days when you're like, oh god, so like I just want to sit in front of the sofa, you know, like on the sofa in front of the TV, and then you drag yourself to class, and then afterwards you feel better because um, there's something about controlled violence that kind of takes down the, you know, whatever uncontrolled emotions you've got going on and inside. And I talked about the sort of the complementary nature of writing and martial arts, and I think for me that has always been most prevalent in the fact that like both of those um, arts are about uh, discipline and perseverance more than they are about talent, and that's something that kind of carries through across both of those fields for me. And I think maybe on the page as well translates into, you know, how I think about the characters, and like them having all the characters that I've written in my novels have like Goku fighting ability. You know, like they just have like they're all big badasses in some way, but that doesn't fix their problems. You know, like that is it's kind of like the Harry Potter syndrome, right? Where it's like they have all these characters have lots of magic, but like that doesn't make life easy for them. And that's the same thing I think that um, that I try to convey in the characters that I write is that they can have a lot of ability in combat, but that's not a quick fix, you know. Like, and it's the same thing with martial arts. Like, okay, now you got your black belt. It's not like, oh, now you're undefeatable, you know. Like you're still going to the gym like every day and having to learn to grow and to keep that up. And so I think there it to me it's not like a spiritual, you know, like so it's I guess it is spiritual insofar as like there's not like it's not like a worldview so much as like how does how is this personally making me a better person, and how do I think about you know, what it brings to me and to other people, and like how did my characters who have all these skills still have all these challenges despite all these skills that they have.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And there's something that Alex, you mentioned earlier, you know, tying into everything we've been talking about, sort of like more spiritual, holistic aspects of martial arts, but the fact that uh, the mainstream popularization of martial arts through things like UFC and other MMA leagues and promoters and stuff like that, but also the Hong Kong films that we grew up on, a lot of it kind of glorifies martial arts in a lot of ways. And you know, sometimes there are truthful aspects to the histories and cultures of these practices that kind of get lost in the shuffle when, you know, someone's just looking at the kick-ass fight that Jackie Chan is in, or, you know, their favorite UFC fighters, or what have you. So Alex, you know, is this mainstreamification, I'll call it, of martial arts a good thing, or sort of what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think by and large it's a good thing. I think it's shown a lot of people the reality of a sport, and really that's what the UFC has become, is a sport. And they've had to make a lot of moves to make it. I mean, from what it started as in the early days with pretty much no holds barred to some extent. In order to make it more popularized, they had to make it a little bit less violent, and you know, pass all the legal hurdles in various states and countries, and now, you know, it's grown, and I think that's good, because it's promoted martial arts, I think, across the world. And it's probably there still is, even though there's a mixed martial arts style that needs to be embraced. If you're going to be a professional athlete in that league, you have to be a mixed martial artist now. You can't just be what it was in the early days, which is karate fighter or a Brazilian jiu-jitsu
Yeah.
fighter or a wrestler. You have to really be an athlete that embraces a variety of those. I think it still does promote individual martial arts, and because it's such a worldwide sport, I mean, it's massive in China, it's massive in Brazil, it's massive in Japan. There's other leagues like One. If you guys have ever seen One FC, that's a out of Singapore. That's that's almost as big as the UFC in a lot of Asia. I think that really helps promote the indigenous martial arts in each of those cultures, because those fighters from those areas are naturally going to embrace some of those and bring their fight style to the game. I mean, I love it. It's changed a lot. There are things I don't like. I don't like I'm not a big fan of like the shit talking and all the self promotion that has to go into it, and how certain parts of that moves away from kind of a more traditional martial arts culture of respect, which I do believe in. I understand it's a business. From a business perspective, it makes perfect sense why fighters like these rise to the top. And but I love it because it really is like growing up with old school kung fu movies, and fighters from different schools challenging the masters from different schools. It's like we have been privileged to live through a time that is like none other, where literally all these martial arts from the early 90s to now have been pitted against each other in a global arena. And there's so much video footage out there. You could just spend lifetimes watching this stuff at this point of various martial arts competing against one another. So I'm like a kid in a candy store still, where um as I said, I can't watch as much as I used to, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. And does anyone else have any comments about the sort of mainstreamification of martial arts, whether it's you know broader popularization through movies or television, or things like UFC, MMA? Whoever
I
wants.
like it when nerdy things become mainstream, because then we're not so strange for having all these like interests.
I agree.
It also means that like when I was a kid desperate to do martial arts, there was like taekwondo, karate, and then like we were the only jiu-jitsu club in the town.
Mhm.
And now you can do anything. Like there's basically no martial art you can't do in my city, if you're interested in it, and you can. It's just made it so much more accessible for kids who love it. Also, even though it probably has sort of glorified a kind of the UFC in particular, a kind of sort of brutal and shit talking sort of personality that kind of maybe has always been in the sort of boxing world, and it's kind of crept
Definitely, yeah.
into the martial art. But I still think that overall, it still doesn't like people who have that mindset most of the time still don't get through martial arts, because like Fonda said, it's largely a game of repetition and persistence and diligence, hard training. It's not just the kind of thing that you sort of come in with a lot of aggression, even if you're athletic, and immediately you're amazing at. It's just not the kind of
Yeah.
sport that rewards that genuinely. So I think that it's made it accessible to way more people. Way more martial arts from way more cultures are available to people across the world.
Mhm.
So I think the accessibility well outweighs any kind of you know glorification of some of the worst aspects of it, because although there'll be some people like that, most of the time the people who stick with martial arts, that if they had that kind of personality, it kind of gets worn out of them through persistence and the frustration of getting beaten over and over again. I mean, maybe I do the kind of martial arts where you do a lot of falling,
Yeah.
and you can only get slammed into the ground so many times and retain an ego, I think.
I think
Yeah.
the ego disillusion is a big thing. And Fonda,
Yeah.
I'll toss it to you in terms of the mainstreamification of martial arts, but also afterward, if you would touch a little bit on martial arts in science fiction and fantasy, if there's more that you would like to see in terms of the uh the future of these art forms within SFF?
Hmm. Well, I mean, as someone who got into martial arts because I was first and foremost a consumer of media with martial arts in it, I'm all for the portrayal of it in a way that broadens that funnel of people who are interested. And you never
Hmm.
know when a piece of media is going to strike you in a way that lights some spark that might otherwise not have been lit. And I came through martial arts through media, and I just right before this podcast, as my son's volleyball game, and he got into that because of an anime show. So like, you never know. Like sometimes there's that that show or that depiction that like that thing that sparks an interest that could be a lifelong journey for you. In terms of what do I want to see in science fiction and fantasy, I feel like I have seen more of it in recent years than there was before. I mean, largely due to the people on this panel and other writers as well. I think one of the things that has happened is that, and I would say this is largely because of self-publishing, is that now if there's something that gets you excited, that you want to write about, and you're now able to find those like-minded people who want to read about it, right? So like, in the past when there were no other options, you might have been like, hey, I want to write a martial arts fantasy, and some publisher might have been like, well, I don't know if the market is big enough for that. Well, now there's definitely a
Yeah.
way to get it out there, and do proof of concept, right? So I think that I've seen a lot more of uh, uh, of people, of authors bringing their own personal passions and love, including martial arts, into the field. I mean, I always, so I write fantasy, but I also have always loved martial arts and science fiction. And like, some of my favorite scenes are like um, the boxing scenes, like the fight scenes that they had in like Battlestar Galactica, and like
Yeah.
seeing like that it's still a part of like people's lives. Like I like the
Yeah.
idea that martial arts is something that is enduring, like we're going to bring into space, into the colony planets and things like that.
Hell yeah, we are.
Yeah. So I think there's sort of a logic. People are like, oh yeah, of course there's going to be sword fights and kind of hand-to-hand combat in fantasy. But I love seeing it in science fiction. I love the idea of it of uh, of the fact that this is just sort of part of our human nature, and like where it's going to endure.
Yeah. Just like more martial arts in SFF. Come on, people. And Alex, what about you? If there's something that you want to see more of in terms of martial arts in relation to SFF, and then afterwards, Sam and Kay, I'll get your takes as well.
I think we're just like Fonda said. I think things are moving in the right direction. I mean, not just SFF, but like even mainstream media shows like Warrior. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but that's a really fantastic show
Yeah.
on HBO. It just got renewed for season 3. Actually, I just read something about that. It was based on like Bruce Lee's original treatment, and the show Kung Fu, which I was a big fan of back in the day, was like Hollywood ripping off Bruce Lee and like putting it in like David Carradine in the place of a Asian guy, and it's kind of sad. But now that Warrior is on the air, I think it's kind of like redeemed that. I think things are moving in the right direction. And I totally agree with Fonda. I love martial arts in science fiction, especially, and just the portrayal of it. And I think that's been something that's around for a while. Just like kind of talking again about what I was at the start of the podcast, how fantasy and the tropes in fantasy are very tied into martial arts tropes. Even, of course, we all know like George Lucas, um, you know being inspired by Kurosawa, and like samurai culture with the Jedi. I think all those things are kind of bleed together. So I love it all. Mandalorian, for example, I know the showrunner for Mandalorian was very inspired by Lone Wolf and Cub, which I'm a really big fan of, and you can see it. It doesn't have to be.
Fantastic
It can be very
Yeah.
subtle. It doesn't have to be like this is kung fu, this is jujitsu. It can be the tropes, the progression, as you said, the master and apprentice relationship. And I think that is something that has been a part of fantasy, but I think it'll all bleed together. It doesn't have to be just like a martial arts story or a Western medieval fantasy. I think books like what Fonda is writing, that blend what a bunch of different um, stuff from a bunch of different things. I think that really is the direction we're heading, and I like it. I love just like mixing tropes together and blending sci-fi and fantasy. I'm super inspired by like JRPGs and anime, and I think some of those formats have less constraints where they're not like this is sci-fi, this is fantasy, this is
Exactly,
medieval,
yeah.
this is from this culture. I think they're it's almost like they get the advantage of assuming it's just a mix from the start, and I think I see fantasy and sci-fi moving in that direction.
Awesome. And Kay, what about you? What's your hopes for the future of martial arts and SFF?
I agree with Alex and Fonda. I like the way the direction things are going now, where you see, for example, in film you see a lot more like Asian people actually doing the
Mhm.
martial arts from their cultures. It's it's a great time. It's no longer like it used to be in the past where it's so alien, like we're having martial arts is suddenly like that material is steeped in orientalism, and it's more subtle now, where this is just a way that this character is fighting. Like, I think a great example in my head is like Raya, where she displays martial arts, but it's not a martial arts movie. It's a fantasy
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
kids. So yeah, it's a great time right now. I like really excited to see what else is in the horizon.
Yeah, I like that because it's kind of just like the representation of martial arts without having to be so explicit about it. It's like you can incorporate it so that it feels natural within the context of the story, the world, what have you. It's like I don't think any of you like explicitly say this is the specific martial arts form or anything like that. It's like no, this is just a natural integration into this world, and it blossoms out of that, and it feels awesome. It just feels really cool because it feels natural to the characters and the context and everything around it. And Sam, I'll get your take to close us out.
Oh, I mean, I think everyone's really said it already, but we're just at a point in time where more people are being allowed to tell stories and making it accessible to broader audiences. And the combination of that with martial arts being more accessible and more mainstream means that we're just getting to see different people from around the world's different takes on what martial arts means to them and how they incorporate it in different kinds of storytelling and how it gets used to tell stories. And like I didn't know I needed a sort of crime family drama where magical Jade enhanced your martial arts abilities until I saw it. So like I don't know what I needed until it's out there. It's so exciting when you find some new take on something, and we're just at that point in time where that's more likely than ever, which is just exciting, I think.
Yeah, it's a beautiful time for martial arts. And just to finish off, Sam, I'll start with you. If you could share one of your absolute favorite representations of martial arts in, you can pick one for fiction and another for film or television.
Well, I've kind of already given some of mine, but I mean, I'm not trying to suck up to Fonda here, but Jade Bone is just so good and so unique in terms of twisting what fantasy looks like in setting, and like basically just writing this generational political crime drama that incorporates so many cool things that we love, in sort of using aspects of things that I've loved from movies as well as storytelling in writing form, to just blend together this entirely fresh saga that I'm just obsessed with. Sorry, Fonda. And I already told you my favorite fight scene from underrated fight scene from
Go watch that movie. It's fantastic. Yeah.
But I will give you my favorite non-martial arts sword fight is the classic sword fight from The Princess Bride between
Hell yes.
Inigo and the Man in Black on the clifftop. It's flawless. Yes. You cannot fault that scene. That is enjoyable dialogue and character and
exactly
superb martial arts at the same time. It's perfect.
Yeah, that for me is like chef's kiss of like character.
My 3-year-old Sam is saying. My 3-year-old is saying, I am Inigo Montoya. You killed my father.
Observe my t-shirt, Alex.
Oh, hell yeah. Oh, my God.
So good.
Beautiful.
And having kids, you can make them like the Princess Bride. Same as you. It's great. Shaping the next generation.
Well, Alex, I'll toss it to you. What's one of your favorite representations in fiction and another pick for film or television?
So not science fiction fantasy, but one of the pieces of fiction that I saw a good representation of martial arts was actually a series called the John Rain series. It's by Barry Eisler. There's a whole series of, it's like this assassin, and it's just fiction. It's kind of like spycraft combined with martial arts, but there's a lot of realistic portrayals of martial arts in that series. I think it was optioned at some point, and Keanu Reeves was going to play the main character. I don't know if it ever materialized, as we all know how these things go, but I would love to see that come to fruition. So that was a really good one. I also am a big fan of, just to make Fonda more embarrassed, of Green Bone Saga. I thought that was fantastic. And as far as film, the old school Fist of Legend is one of my favorites, with Jet Li. I just love that movie. I haven't seen it for a while, but I probably have to, when the kids are old enough, I'll show it to them.
Yeah. Oh, you're raising them right with the Princess Bride and all that already, so you're good. And Fonda, what about you? A pick for fiction and one for film or television?
Oh gosh, this is hard. I'm actually going to mention a book that is not speculative at all. It is a very slim novel called The Long Shot by Katie Kitamura. And it's like one of the most realistic portrayals of an MMA fighter that I've like ever read. It's I don't think I've ever really seen it mentioned anywhere else. But I will also mention another MMA movie called Warrior, starring Tom Hardy, that was released.
Yeah, that's such a good movie.
Maybe a decade ago or so. And again, like a small film that like I don't hear anyone talking about, but it's about these two brothers, and it is like it's chock full of feels. Like I'm just like crying in this MMA movie, but a great example of like martial arts as sort of this catharsis for character development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome picks. Warrior is fantastic. It was a really good movie. Warrior the TV show. Check them both out for sure.
Yes, both of those really good. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kay, we'll close out with you with your two picks, one for fiction, another for film or TV.
So the one for fiction, Jade City.
You guys, I'm not even paying you. They're gonna think that I'm paying you.
Yeah.
That's what this podcast panel is for, Fonda's promotion.
No, that's a great book.
Drinks are on me, next con.
Yeah. Yeah. The other one that comes to mind is it's a combination. It's manga, anime. It's Full Metal Alchemist.
Hell yeah, so good.
I loved how, like, you know how Edward is not the biggest character and he's disabled. He doesn't have an arm or a leg, but they still have him training in martial arts so that you know, maybe not overpower, but you know, he can go up to the stronger opponents, and also as a way to like train his body to make him, you know, fit despite his disabilities and despite his disadvantages. And I particularly love that it was like a woman who was instructing them as well.
Yeah.
And like how she was like really competent and they were so scared of her. And, you know, it's just great.
Yeah, I recommend that show in like all its forms. I think the anime has
Yes.
like 2 different studios that have created 2 different
Yeah.
versions, but both are fantastic. It's just like all of it.
I
is
can't believe
amazing.
we didn't mention Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
They're just
Okay, next
it's
panel.
beautiful.
Next
Like,
panel.
The effortless
Not the movie.
different styles that
Like
they're portraying
whoever,
that are so great.
whoever's listening or watching,
Not the
do
movie.
not
yes,
watch the
you-
movie by M. Night
No, no, not the
Shyamalan. Please, the anime is fantastic, and Legend of Korra is like a pretty solid follow up. But the Avatar is just delicious martial arts anime in all
Yes.
its many forms. Cool. Well, Fonda, Sam, Kay, Alex, thank you all so much for sharing your insights about martial arts. I appreciate you taking the time. If you could please share with viewers and listeners where they can find you on social media. We'll start with you, Fonda.
You can find me online at my website, fondalee.com. I'm on Twitter at FondaJLee and Instagram at fonda.lee.
Awesome. And Sam?
I'm at Sam Hawke Writes on Twitter and Instagram. I do have a website, which is samhawkewrites.com, but I haven't updated it in a while, sorry. So it's probably easiest to find me on Twitter or Insta.
Cool. Thank you. And Kay?
It's probably best to just look me up on Twitter. It's K_Villoso. And that's where I do all my,
All your
rambling.
shenanigans.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And Alex, what about you?
I'm combat codes for everything. Website, Twitter, Instagram. It's just combat codes.
Awesome. Cool. Well, y'all, thank you so much for chatting with me. I appreciate you being here. And yeah, we look forward to having you on the show again. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Adrian. Good to see everyone.